In the work that we do here, it should come as no surprise to anyone that I'm a fan of historical markers. Even before work began on this channel, and even when I was a kid, if I ever saw a historical marker on the side of the road, I wanted to stop and see what it said. I always enjoyed the visions they gave my imagination of what the landscape there once looked like, especially since most historical markers now sit in front of empty plots of land or modern buildings out of sync with what the marker claims. As time went on, I would eventually come across rare historical markers that piqued more than my young imagination could handle. These led to rabbit hole searches into strange tales, and probably laid the early groundwork for this channel itself. This was well before the days of the internet, so I spent a lot of my time in libraries and archives as a kid, and shockingly still remember how the Dewey Decimal System and the card catalog worked. And much to my nerdy enjoyment, my local library still has theirs. Anyway, today's story just reminded me of those days from the historical marker I uncovered for this case. Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Heaster Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother and described how she was killed by her husband Edward. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Edward, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to the state prison. Only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. Elva Zona Heaster Shue was born in 1873 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, and as far as can be found in history, spent her entire life in Greenbrier. The Heaster family lived at the base of Little Sewell Mountain on a modest little family farm, doing what they could to eke out a meager living. Jacob and Mary Jane Heaster had 5 children in all, in which Zona, as she preferred to be called, was the middle child and the only girl. The Hesters mostly lived off the land, in an area of the country where nature itself could rise up and take your life. This, coupled with the extreme winters of the mountains of West Virginia, had the Heaster family hard and seasoned, much like all of the other families in Appalachia. Also, like the others, the Hesters were known as an honest, God-fearing family and prided themselves on the family name and reputation, something that was more valuable than gold at the time. According to tales from the locals, though, Zona didn't share this pride and connection with the land as so many others did. She was a wild spirit, and seemed to want something more than what the little remote community could offer. And in her search for freedom, it appears that Zona developed a taste for bad boys. Much to the dismay of the local community, Zona had a child in 1895 out of wedlock when she was around 21 or 22 years old, with a man named George Wooldridge. It's said that George wasn't someone that would have been picked as an ideal husband for anyone's daughter. He was broke, had no job, and couldn't even support himself, much less a wife and kid. George was fine with that though. He's reported as saying that he and Zona had just one drunken romp late one night and questioned whether the child was actually his or not. Now, whether Zona had a reputation to add any weight into that defense or not remains to be seen, but something about the situation allowed George to avoid the minister or a shotgun wedding situation from the Heaster family. Whatever happened, it's interesting to note that other than the actual birth, there are no further records of the child at all. We don't know what happened to it, whether it was a boy or a girl, nothing at all. This event, as well as some good old-fashioned motherly scolding and guidance from her mother, Zona seemed to turn away from the bad boys of the county. Kind of. A couple of years later, Zona fell for a new blacksmith in the area, a man named Erasmus Stribling Shue, who went by the name Trout. Trout was new to Greenbrier County from neighboring Fayette County, and unlike Zona's previous guy, Trout was the son of a respected blacksmith and followed in his father's footsteps. Trout also brought with him some baggage though, and it wasn't baggage that was unknown to those in the area. Even though he was only 10 years older than Zona, he had been married before, twice. Trout had been accused of abusing his first wife, Allie Cutlip. They married in 1885 and had a daughter 2 years later. It isn't clear when the actual abuse started, but it reached a point that a local group of boys decided to take matters into their own hands. One night, they broke into the Shue house, dragged Trout from his bed, and threw him in a nearby frozen river as a warning. Trout denied ever abusing his wife, but it didn't matter. Rumors had already started doing their thing, and he was shunned in the community. Not long after, Trout spent 2 years in jail for horse theft, and by the time he got out, Allie and her daughter had moved on with their lives. After being freed from jail, Trout's next marriage was to 16-year-old Lucy Ann Tritt. About 6 months later, Lucy Ann was found dead. Stories in the area say Trout was working on the chimney of their home and dropped a brick on Lucy Ann's head. Because of the man's past and the rumors that surrounded it, many people believe that this could have been intentional. Some researchers don't buy this story though, as it isn't documented. The death is, but only says it was on February 11th, 1895. Some point out that it was unlikely that chimney work would have been taking place in the dead of winter, and use the time frame in Lucy's young age to paint a picture of a young woman becoming pregnant out of wedlock and dying either during childbirth or from a miscarriage due to their short marriage. Of course, none of that is documented either, so pick your poison. It was after the death of Lucy Ann that Trout Shue moved to Greenbrier County and met Zona Heaster. It's unknown as to whether Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, had heard the rumors about Trout or not, but for Mary Jane, the facts were bad enough. Trout was twice married, had nothing to do with his first child, and had spent time in jail. Not exactly son-in-law material in her eyes. Zona wouldn't be swayed though, and her and Trout were married in October of 1896. They moved a few miles away to the small community of Richlands. But shortly after the new year in 1897, Zona fell sick. She was under the home care of Dr. George Knapp for the next few weeks, but what she was sick from was never documented. Some speculate that Zona was pregnant due to her and Trout's quick marriage, but there is nothing to confirm that. The doctor did point out that Trout stayed by her side and seemed like a devoted husband. On the morning of January 23rd, 1897, Trout Shue stopped by home on his way to work at the forge. He asked the lady there, someone known to the community as Aunt Martha, if she would ask her son, 11-year-old Anderson Jones, if he would go by the house and help Zona gather eggs. Zona was still somewhat weak, and Trout didn't want her out in the freezing cold. Anderson was busy with chores and errands, but Aunt Martha assured Trout that she would send Anderson that way as soon as he got home. According to Aunt Martha, Trout returned a little later to see if Anderson had been by to check on Zona, but he had not returned home yet. Aunt Martha said that seemed to agitate Trout, and he returned 3 more times that morning to see if Anderson had been to the Shue home yet. It was a little after lunch when Anderson finally made it to the Shue house. There, he found Zona Heaster Shue inside, dead. Anderson ran from the house screaming and rushed home as quick as he could. He told his mother all about it, and together they ran to get Trout and the doctor. By the time Dr. Knapp got to the house, Trout was already there, cradling Zona's head in his lap. Zona had already been moved to the bedroom, and Trout had already changed her clothes. She now had on a dress with a high stiff collar, along with her favorite scarf. Dr. Knapp found no signs of life and attempted to do a quick examination as to the cause of death, but this aggravated Trout. The doctor wrote it off as Trout's grief, and since he had been already treating Zona's sickness, he left Trout alone, documenting the death as, quote, everlasting faint, later changing the cause of death to childbirth. In a later interview, Anderson Jones describes what he found at the Shue house. Going to the house, I felt that something was wrong. All of the doors were closed, and there was an air about the place I did not like. Reaching the steps, I saw a trail of blood. That scared me, but I went to the door and knocked. No one answered. I tried it, and finding the door unlocked, walked into the kitchen. The trail of blood continued across the floor to the dining room. This door, too, was closed. Once more I knocked and, getting no answer, walked in. I stumbled over Miss Shue's body. There she was, stretched out on the floor, looking right up at me through wide open eyes. She seemed to be laughing. I was frightened, but still able to reach down and shake her. She was stiff and cold. Running from the house, I called across the field to Aunt Martha, "Miss Shue is dead." As she ran to the house, I went down the road for Mr. Shue, finding him at the blacksmith shop with Charles Tapscott. When I told him what I had found, he let out a yell and with Mr. Tapscott started for the house. I continued on to get Dr. Knapp. According to Anderson's own words, it's highly unlikely that Trout had the chance to change Zona's clothes alone, as the legend states. It would seem that Aunt Martha would have had a chance to beat Trout to the house. It's more likely that Trout was assisted in moving Zona to the bedroom and changing her clothes. This is something that would have been common in that day and not viewed as strange like tampering or moving a body would be today. The description of the trail of blood tends to support the idea of Zona being pregnant as well, along with her final cause of death being listed as childbirth, or what we today call a miscarriage. Dr. Knapp sent word ahead to the Heaster family of their daughter's death, and the next day, Trout arrived at the Hester's farm with the body of Zona. Trout rarely left his wife's side during the wake. He kept her head cradled between a pillow and a folded sheet, quote, to keep her comfortable. Zona was buried 2 days later, on January 25th, 1897, in the graveyard at Soul Methodist Church on Sewell Mountain. Mary Jane Heaster, Zona's mother, had never let go of her dislike of Trout Shue. It's reported that when she was told of her daughter's death, she immediately responded with, "The devil has killed her." After the funeral, Mary Jane attempted to return the pillow and folded up sheet that had been placed around Zona's head to Trout, but he didn't want them, so Mary Jane took them home. There, she set about hand-washing the sheet to be put away. While she did this, Mary Jane claims that the stench of death rose from the wash basin, and the water turned red as blood. As quick as this happened, the smell disappeared, and the water cleared to normal. At first, Mary Jane thought this was a trick of her imagination because of grief, but the sheet itself remained stained pink afterwards. Mary Jane took this as a surefire sign, a vision sent to her to know something was not as it seemed. With nothing else to go off of other than that, the only thing Mary Jane could think of was to pray to God for help. She spent the next several nights praying for the truth to be revealed, and it would seem those prayers were answered. One dark night, a glowing white light appeared to Mary Jane before disappearing into the dark. The next night, Zona appeared, not so much as a ghost, but physical, as if she were still alive, yet cold and stiff to the touch. This happened for the next 3 nights, and Zona herself told her mother the story of what had happened to her. According to Zona, or the ghost of Zona, Trout had arrived home from work the night before her death and flew into a fit of rage because, although Zona had dinner prepared and ready, there was no meat to go with it. Trout grabbed Zona around the throat in an attempt to choke her, but his grip was too strong. Rather than choking her, he broke her neck. As the spirit of Zona left her mother for the final time after finishing her story, she stopped in the doorway and turned her head a full 180 degrees to look back at her mother, a sign of proof in her mother's eyes. Mary Jane Heaster went to the county prosecutor, John Alfred Preston, and begged him to open an investigation into Trout Shue. Preston said he could not do so without any sort of proof, so Mary Jane told him the story of Zona's ghost and what all she had confessed to her. Now, it isn't documented as to whether Preston believed the story from Mary Jane, or if he was just going on speculation from the rumors and murmurs he'd been hearing, both of Trout's past and now the recent suspicion of foul play. But either way, Preston decided to pay Dr. Knapp a visit, Dr. Knapp did admit to Preston about how it bothered him that he was not able to perform a full examination of Zona after her death. So, in an effort to put the rumors of the community at rest for sure, Preston ordered that the body of Zona Shue be exhumed and a full medical examination be performed, something that was completely unheard of in rural Appalachia at the time. Death and spirits were as common to the Appalachian people as night and day, and no one wanted to be the one that would be assigned to disturbing the dead. The prosecutor had a very, very hard time recruiting a team to exhume the body, and eventually had to resort to the threat of prosecution under obstruction of justice to those that refused to help. On March the 9th, 1897, more than a month after her death, the body of Zona Heaster Shue was dug up and moved to nearby Nickel Schoolhouse for examination. Trout was ordered to be on hand as well, being the next of kin and all. Naturally, Trout had objected to the disturbance of his wife's grave, but under the threat of a court order, he obliged. He's quoted as telling witnesses that he knew he'd be arrested, but he wasn't worried because they wouldn't be able to prove that he did it. Those that believe Mary Jane Hester said that this was an admission, and that he said that because he was confident he had covered his tracks. Those on the side of Trout Shue said that his words meant that no one would be able to prove he did it because he didn't do it. I'll leave that up for you to decide which is which. Trout sat in a corner, whittling and seemingly unconcerned, while 3 doctors, headed by Dr. Knapp, got to work. The body itself was remarkably well preserved due to the cold winter ground. The team of doctors set about checking the contents of Zona's stomach and other vital organs, as was normal process, while a small group of curious neighbors watched on. Anderson Jones, the young boy who had first found the body of Zona, was on hand as well. In an interview, he stated, "Dr. Knapp was working around Miss Shue's head. I could see Mr. Shue was getting more nervous. His whittling was not so good." Suddenly, the doctor turned to Mr. Preston. They whispered together for a few minutes. Then Mr. Preston turned to Mr. Shue and said, "Well, Shue, we have found your wife's neck to be broken." Mr. Shue's head dropped. A change came over him that I can't explain, but it certainly proved his guilt to me. According to an article in the Pocahontas Times, on the throat were the marks of fingers, indicating that she had been choked, that the neck was dislocated between the first and second vertebrae. The ligaments were torn and ruptured. The windpipe had been crushed at a point in front of the neck. Trout Shue was arrested on sight and held without bond for the murder of his wife, Zona Heaster Shue. Trout was put under constant watch. It's not clear as to whether he was grieving his wife or was worried he had been found out, but the Pocahontas Times reported on May the 20th, 1897, Trout Shue, now in jail awaiting trial for the murder of his wife, has threatened to kill himself. While waiting for the circuit judge to schedule time to be there for trial, Prosecutor Preston did what he could to build his case, something that seemed impossible since the only evidence he had was circumstantial. The trial began on June the 30th, 1897. Prosecutor Preston stayed away from Mary Jane's story of the ghost of Zona Shue, and instead focused on the hard facts of the case, pointing out how the body had been dressed and treated to seemingly secure the head and neck from moving, and how Trout had gotten in the way of any full examinations. Witnesses were called that testified that immediately after the funeral, Trout's grief in losing his wife seemed to disappear completely. There were even witnesses from within the jail itself that testified how Trout told them he would never be convicted and that his goal was to marry 7 women total in his life. Preston knew that he couldn't enter Mary Jane's account of the ghost of Zona Shue into evidence, since such things were now inadmissible in court hearings ever since the Salem witch trials fiasco. But then again, he didn't need to. By that time, everyone had heard the story around the community, and his bet was that many, if not all, of the jurors were now familiar with it as well. Then it was the defense's turn. They offered several different theories as to how the neck of Zona Shue could have been broken. During the dressing of the body, when the body was put into the coffin, during the 15-mile wagon ride to the graveyard, there was ample opportunity for the neck to have been accidentally broken. But in the end, they couldn't leave well enough alone. They had to bring up the story of Mary Jane Hester's account of the ghost of her daughter Zona, even going as far as putting Mary Jane on the stand in order to discredit her and shoot holes in her story. And with no objection from the prosecution, anyone on the jury that didn't already know the story was open to it for the first time. They attacked not only the story, but Mary Jane's character itself, trying to rile up the mountain woman and get her to break. But Mary Jane was having nothing of it. Reports said that Mary Jane stayed polite and dignified throughout the whole ordeal, constantly pointing out that she was not a superstitious person and never wavered from her story. The jury itself believed in the evidence. They believed in a mother's intuition, and they believed, as most mountain folks do, even today, in spirits. The jury returned in less than an hour with a guilty verdict, and Trout was sentenced to life in prison. He was sent away to the West Virginia State Prison in Moundsville and served only 3 years before passing away from a reported epidemic that ran through the prison on March 13, 1900. He is buried in an unmarked grave on the prison grounds. He was 38 or 39 years old at the time. There were no more reports of Zona Heaster Shue's ghost after that. If she was ever seen again, it was never documented or reported. Most like to think that the spirit is now resting in peace since justice was finally served. Mary Jane Heaster, Zona's mother, never changed her story for the rest of her life. Of course, newspapers periodically brought the story back up over the years, sensationalizing the story into folklore little by little. The most popular version that survives today is that Trout Shue murdered all 3 of his wives, but history shows us that Zona was the only one killed, and possibly his second wife, Lucy Ann. Allie Cutlip, Trout's first wife, went on to remarry and have many more children, and outlived Trout by nearly 42 years. There's been a fair amount of skeptics that poke holes in the story, but in the end, the autopsy does show that Zona's neck was broken, just as Mary Jane Heaster had said, and according to her, just like the ghost of her daughter had told her. The most logical theory I've come across lays the events out like this. Zona was pregnant. She met her husband outside that evening when he returned home from work, and an argument ensued for whatever reason. It was then that Zona felt the trickle of blood gush down her legs from a miscarriage. She turned and ran inside, but Trout was already enraged by this time, maybe even escalating if they were married so quickly just because she was pregnant. Zona made it to the dining room, but Trout caught her from behind and broke her neck, intentionally or accidentally. Either way, he saw the trail of blood and figured the doctor would blame the death on the miscarriage. But still, it's hard to explain away the story from Zona's mother. She knew details that she shouldn't have been able to know. Details that an autopsy on an exhumed corpse proved to be correct. Die-hard skeptics and crime and legal junkies admit, based on the evidence of the case itself, Trout Shue should have walked free. But even they admit that doesn't mean that Trout Shue was innocent. And it doesn't mean that Mary Jane Heaster didn't talk with the ghost of her daughter. Some see the appearance of the ghost of Zona Heaster Shue as a miracle, righting a wrong. For me, in knowing places like these and the time frame of the events, I believe it was a miracle that Trout Shue even made it to the courthouse, alive, to begin with.